Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Andrew Outten, and I'm the Director of Education at Brandywine Battlefield Park for the Brandywine Battlefield Park Associates, as well as the Chairman for the Brandywine Battlefield Task Force. Again, I'd like to welcome you all out this evening and thank you for joining us tonight. It's a great turnout. I saw the names of the attendees before this, and it's always good to see new faces as well as familiar faces. So we do miss you. It'll be a year this Friday since we were closed at the Brandywine Battlefield Park, and so we hope to see you again soon. So I'm going to go ahead and start the slide. So before we get into tonight's talk, a few housekeeping items here. Just to let you know, this presentation is being recorded. There will be a Q&A, question and answer session following the presentation program. As you have questions, if you should have questions, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom menu. And total disclaimer, since we are working from home, at any time during the presentation, I'm apologizing ahead of time. My dog may start barking, so I will stop him as soon as I hear that. So apologizing ahead of time for that, if that does happen. So what we'll be talking about this evening, this presentation is called Destruction and Wanton Waste, the Impact of War in the Peaceful Valley. And the items throughout the program tonight will be covering brief background, just 18th century Chester County, politics in Pennsylvania at the outset of the American Revolution. I focus primarily on three Quakers that were living within Birmingham Township at the time of the Battle of Brandywine. We're going to be discussing British strategies, logistics, and other pertinent pre-battle items that relate to the topic tonight. And we'll go into a very brief overview of the Battle of Brandywine just to give some background and some content to what I'm trying to get across this evening. Following that, we'll talk about the three Quakers that we're focusing on and their experiences following the Battle of Brandywine itself and the total impact on the civilian population living within the battlefield landscape. So Chester County before the American Revolution, predominantly a Quaker community. If you drive around today, you will see a number of meeting houses, all of which pretty much existed at the time of the American Revolution, dating back to as early as the late 17th century. So it was a rich agricultural and textile trading system, very well connected to both port cities of Wilmington and Philadelphia. A lot of the major roads that we travel down today were major roads in the 18th century. But they also had primitive but usable roads as well. So all in all, they were very connected. They were well informed, but they were also cautious as well. Keep in mind that the Quaker faith, very peaceful, abhorred war at all costs, and they are going to be very wary on getting into the politics of the day, especially at the time of the American Revolution. So all in all, Chester County was a very prosperous, peaceful, and hardworking community, well-informed, well-connected. So I will give a plug for the 1777 Chester County Atlas, Property Atlas. If you want to see what roads existed at the time that still exist today, I have a link to that at the end of the presentation. So it's a great project and it's helped a lot with interpretive efforts at the park and with the task force itself. Now we have a revolution in this well-connected, cautious, well-informed community, predominantly Quaker community. Now, when we think of the American Revolution, often taught at a young age, two sides of the conflict. We obviously have the British and we have the Americans, or the Continental Army under George Washington. If you want to take it one step further, we can add the German auxiliaries that are supporting the British, the Crown forces, and we can add all three of the allies that assisted in some way throughout the American Revolution with the continental efforts as well. And that's not to mention the Native American alliances that were forged by both sides throughout the war. All in all, we have two sides to a conflict, right? Very easy, one side versus the other. But in reality, that's not really the case. The reality of this revolution is you obviously have that one side, the Crown forces, the other side, the Continentals and their allies throughout the war. But we also have a third column. This is the column that often gets neglected and often gets left out of the interpretive process. and wasn't really part of the interpretive process at Brandywine until a few decades ago. We really only like to focus on the war, the conflict itself, the military figures, the strategies, and all of that. But this is a new interpretive component that we are trying to bring to the forefront of our interpretive process at the park, and that is going to be the third column of what are known as the disaffected during this conflict. The people who didn't want to really get involved, didn't want to choose sides, just really wanted to continue to live their lives and not dive into one side of the conflict or the other. Polarization is going to be a major issue at the time of the revolution. It's a major issue in all conflicts. We still experience that today, unfortunately, but there is that third column, and that is going to cause a lot of problems, especially in Pennsylvania, where you have a large Quaker population that, again, are trying to live peaceful, simple lives, that are taking strict testimony of peace, that basically is a promise to their meeting, their membership, that says they will not get involved in armed conflict. So when revolution comes to Pennsylvania, there's a major issue with that, and that's what we're going to focus on a little bit tonight. So we talk about Pennsylvania. Obviously, it is going to be founded by William Penn. It was a very tolerant colony out of the 13 original colonies, but it was also a fragmented colony, as I was just hinting at on the last slide, especially when the revolution comes around. You have a wide variety of religious, ethnic, political backgrounds, and it was really governed on Quaker principles. Philadelphia was the home to Enlightenment thinking, but also political radicalism. And it all ties into a close connection with the mother country of Great Britain. They were experiencing economic prosperities. Philadelphia was a major port city, and a lot of people did not want that to change. So when you look at the bigger picture, there was a lack of unity and a very wide spectrum of ideologies, which made compromise coming to one outcome or conclusion nearly impossible. And that's going to really be a major issue again. Before the revolution, as we lead up to the revolution, we start to see this political shift in Philadelphia. And before the summer of 1776, Pennsylvania was really controlled by a General Assembly, again, going off of those Quaker principles when it comes to government. Leading to independence, the Assembly ordered Pennsylvania's congressional delegation to dissent from and utterly reject a proposition that may cause or lead to a separation from our mother country. So a lot of people were not in favor. Pennsylvania was actually on the late end of supporting independence. And that's going to be a problem when you also have a large radical population that is all for independence. So when the men of the Assembly's minds couldn't be changed by these radicals, that's when they started to change the Assembly itself. So by June of 1776, we start to see a new Pennsylvania state government form. And this Provincial Conference of Pennsylvania established an oath, basically renouncing all allegiance to King George III, that was required to be taken by all those who wanted to vote for the convention's delegates. And this oath was a religious test, and that went against the long history of Pennsylvania's religious tolerance. But a lot of people are saying that it was directly aimed at the Quaker population because of their neutrality, because they didn't want to get involved. And this essentially failed at first. So the idea was, if you're not with us, you're against us. And that is going to be how the first steps in solving this problem of neutrality within the colony of Pennsylvania. So the radicals do, long story short, we can focus all night just on that. They do eventually gain control, and to solidify that control, by the summer of 1777, they are going to issue what is known as the Test Act. And with this Test Act is going to come a new oath of allegiance, which required all Pennsylvanians to renounce and refuse all allegiance to King George III, King of Great Britain, his heirs and successors, and to be faithful and bear true allegiance to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania as a free and independent state. Furthermore, all of these citizens were to also swear that if they should discover and make known to some one justice of the peace of said state all treasons or traitorous conspiracies, which I now know or hereafter shall know to be formed against the United States. So basically, they had to swear allegiance to this newly formed government, renouncing all allegiance to King George III. And they had to swear allegiance and swear an oath that they would basically throw anybody under the bus that they caught going against this oath of allegiance. So this is you can start to see a major problem, especially again when you have a dominant Quaker population. This oath was to be taken in front of a justice of the peace who documented each person. In some cases, persons were given certificates to confirm that they had taken the oath in order to protect themselves from persecution. And those who refused to take this oath were essentially stripped of all of their privileges and protections, which included they could not vote or hold any form of public office. They could not serve on a jury or sue anybody in court. They could not buy, sell, or transfer real estate. Any weapons that they owned could be confiscated to support anybody who's going to support the new revolutionary cause. And you risked arrest that was totally justified. A lot of people were trying to plead their case going against this, saying it was not justified. It was against their rights as citizens. But to this newly formed government, that is not going to be the case. This was totally justified because it risked potential downfall to this new government itself. So this is the stage that's set, and this is what a lot of these Quakers are dealing with, especially in Chester County. And we're going to get into three Quakers in particular that had at first very different ideologies, different experiences, but in the long run, in the end, after the Battle of Brandywine and the later part of the American Revolution, they are going to share similar experiences as you're going to come to find out. But before we do that, forgot about this one. This one's also important. In 1777, you also have something known as the Militia Act being passed by this newly formed government. And this Militia Act required all capable males in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to serve or support their local militia in some capacity. Now, the Pennsylvania militia, as one viewer on this webinar can attest, he is our militia guru at the park, Ralph Denlinger. I know you're out there. He could give you a much better background to the structure of the Pennsylvania militia during the American Revolution. And all I'm going to say is very convoluted. There's a lot of moving parts, a lot of components. But in Pennsylvania at the time, you had to serve or support the local militia in some capacity. And if you did not, a tax would be implemented and you would have to pay that tax in order to support the militia. If you could not fight yourself, you could hire a substitute to go and fight in your stead. Those who refused were harassed. Those who refused to pay the tax, however, as I just mentioned, were harassed by recruiters, tax collectors, neighbors, anybody who was in support of this new radical movement. You faced a lot of persecution if you didn't do this. So these Quakers are found in a tough position between a rock and a hard place. Damned if you do, damned if you don't, so to speak. If they were caught serving in the militia themselves, they were read out of meeting. They could no longer participate. They were exiled from their place of worship. If they were caught paying the tax, depending on how strict the rules were, how conservative the meeting was, they could be read out of meeting. They could be exiled. Hiring a substitute, exile. There was one case in Kennett Township where an American soldier came into a wheelwright shop and demanded that the wheelwright make him wheels for an artillery piece, a cannon. And so the the gentleman felt threatened, and he made the wheels, and he pleaded his case in front of his monthly meeting, and they exiled just for supporting the war in that way. So again, damned if you do, damned if you don't. They're in a very tough position at this point. And so before 1777, the war had never really reached Chester County other than word of mouth. But by summer 1777, that is going to take a dramatic change of course. Now, for Chester County, the militia, the average company from a single township was around 50. Now, in Birmingham Township, where we're going to focus on today, where these 3 Quakers lived that we're going to talk about next, where you have, again, that high population of Quakers, you had 11 privates raised. That is going to be very, very low. And that just, again, goes to show you how strong the Quaker faith was in this part of Chester County. And Birmingham Township is going to make up the majority of the battlefield landscape that we're going to talk about later on in the presentation here. So the first Quaker that I mentioned of the 3 that we're going to talk about tonight is Mr. Gideon Gilpin. Gideon Gilpin lived in one of the homes on our park grounds. If you've been to the park before, the original structure was built in 1745, and if you're looking at this picture here, it's going to be the one on the right with the storm doors and the back door and the window right above that door. That is the only existing structure that would have been here at the time of the Battle of Brandywine. The section to the left of that, if you can see the chimney in the background there, that is going to be the newest section that was added on in 1835, 10 years after Mr. Gilpin's death. And the rear kitchen structure was added on in 1782. So that was 5 years after the Battle of Brandywine. Mr. Gilpin lived here with his young family. Gideon was 40 years old at the time of the Battle of Brandywine. And for the longest time, Gideon tried to uphold neutrality. He tried to live his life as much as he possibly could, even though there was a war going on around him. And again, Chester County, the war hadn't come to Chester County physically until 1777, and Gideon Gilpin is going to be thrown right in the thick of things. Gideon was a cattle and a wheat farmer. That's important to keep in mind when we talk about the aftermath of the battle. But all in all, again, he is going to try to remain as neutral as possible throughout this conflict in the beginning 2 years of the American Revolution. The second Quaker that we're going to talk about this evening is Mr. Benjamin Ring, who lives on the opposite side of the Brandywine Battlefield Park in what is known as Washington's headquarters. Benjamin Ring was in support of the American cause from the outset of the war. He had several sons that were also involved with the war effort on the muster rolls for the Chester County Militia. He offers up General George Washington his home to make use of as his headquarters from the 9th to the 11th of September, 1777, the day of the battle. And he was one of the wealthier, more prominent members of this community. Benjamin Ring, it was said, owned the largest house in the neighborhood. He was a farmer, but he was also a miller. He was a fuller. Fulling mill is where you get your finished woolen products. And that mill was actually run out of what is now the modern day Chadsport Township building directly across the street. So between the milling business and the farming, he did very well for himself. And again, he owned one of the more prominent homes in the neighborhood. He's one of the wealthier individuals of Birmingham Township at that time. Very well known, very well connected in the community. He was a member of the Concord Friends Meeting House, which is about 4 miles down the road to the east from Brandywine Battlefield Park. But he eventually, for supporting the war effort, was read out of meeting. The third Quaker that we're going to be focusing on is Joseph Townsend. Joseph Townsend was a 21-year-old man at the time of the Battle of Brandywine, living just to the west of Westchester on his family's farm. He was a member of the Birmingham Friends Meeting House, and we'll talk about Townsend's impact on the interpretation of the battle later on in the program, because in 1841, at the time, just directly before the time of his death, Joseph Townsend gives us one of the best civilian primary source accounts of the battle. So that has been crucial in helping our understanding of us understanding the battle from the civilian side. So before we dive into the battle itself, it's important to understand British strategy, British logistics, and other pertinent information leading up to the battle. So the British are going to leave New York Harbor. General Howe is going to load up roughly 260 transport ships with 18,000 musket-carrying soldiers. That's excluding the all of the camp followers, the civilians that are following the army, the officers, the servants, other members of the army. So all in all, the British are sitting around 23,000 souls on board these 260 transport ships. And their initial goal was to sail south from New York Harbor and gain access through the Delaware Bay to the Delaware River, and eventually head up the Delaware River to the colonial capital of Philadelphia. Now, for reasons that vary, Howe did not do that. He did not go up the Delaware Bay and into the Delaware River. It was said that he met the ship, the HMS Roebuck, at the mouth of the Delaware Bay, and the ship captain basically told him, "You don't want to do that." It could have been for a number of reasons. The Delaware Bay is a very hard body of water to traverse, even in today's maritime standards. There were known American defenses on either side of the river going up in Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. All in all, General Howe didn't want to risk taking his men up there. But one of the major reasons why General Howe didn't do that was, as I just mentioned, the American defenses. One of the series of American defenses was right outside the city of Philadelphia itself. And those were a series of defenses known as chevaux de frise. And these chevaux de frise were essentially giant baskets, 30 by 30 foot wide baskets that were weighed down with massive stones and had a series of timbers with large iron spikes fastened to them. And these were purposely put at the bottom of the Delaware River in strategic places, as you can see on the map there, to blockade the city, to prevent any major shipping from coming up and gaining access to the port city of Philadelphia. Now, the concept of the chevaux de frise goes back hundreds and hundreds of years to land warfare. Primarily, you can see these stick-like things. If you watch any old war movies, like Vikings on the History Channel, they use these in them. It was to prevent. It was used as a means of creating a fortification, but it was also used to repel cavalry charges as well. Chevaux de frise, the horses of Friesland. Friesland was a Dutch province that its army was lacking in the terms of cavalry. So in order to repel enemy cavalry charges, they used these primarily for that purpose of protecting their infantry on the battlefield. So we took that and we adapted it to the water. And again, placed these in strategic places outside the colonial capital of Philadelphia. Again, as you can see on the map there on the right-hand side. Now, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't do a plug for the Battlefield Park, because our most recent acquisition in our museum in 2017, when we actually got a real-life cheval de frise, and it's cheval in the singular, but chevaux in the plural, cheval de frise that washed up after Hurricane Sandy in 2012 on the banks of the Delaware River in Bristol, Pennsylvania. So you can see it's massive. The exhibits below it give it some perspective and on how massive it really is. And this is the picture above the museum gallery is when they originally hoisted it out of the water. So if you want to come and see that, when we do reopen to the public, we welcome you with open arms to come in and check that out. So all in all, General Howe, no matter if he didn't want to traverse it because it was too rocky, he didn't want to risk the American defenses, he is going to sail south, and he is going to eventually add about 2.5 weeks on to his anticipated travel time to reach the head of Elk at the head of the Chesapeake Bay. So you can see that is an extended voyage, again, totally unanticipated, and his supplies are going to dwindle very rapidly. The livestock that was on these ships are having to be thrown overboard because they are succumbing So the lack of food and provisions just for the livestock alone. The rations for the men are being thrown overboard because they're spoiling. The logistics of the British from the outset of the war was always a problem for the Crown forces here in North America. The North government over in England were relying heavily on loyalists to provide provisions for the army here in America. So they were living off the land, trying to win the hearts and minds of the people here to help supply the army itself as well. So to get a better understanding for what these soldiers were eating as rations or being supplied as rations, the provisions for these British soldiers, we do have a good idea of what these soldiers were receiving. According to the Three Rivers Garrison in Canada, the allowance of the provisions set for an average British soldier on June 11, 1777 are as follows. And this is going to be a pretty standard across the board provisions list for the common soldier serving in the British forces at that time. So on a good day, the average daily ration for a British soldier, the complete ration would have been for one man for one day in every species, flour or bread, pound and a half, a pound of beef, half pound of pork, quarter pint of peas, 1 ounce of butter, and 1 ounce of rice. So that's on an ideal, perfect day, no problem. Whenever the situation of the army prevents this distribution of provisions, it will be delivered in the following manner: flour or bread, pound and a half of that, pound and a half of beef, or 10 ounces of pork. All right, so that's on an, okay, our provisions are lacking a little bit. Let's try to ration things off and be a little bit more conservative. So that's that's what the British soldiers would get in that case. Should it happen that no provisions except flour or bread can be issued, a complete ration is as follows: flour or bread, 3 pounds, or a pound and a half of rice. All right, so that's on a drastic day. We really need to cut back. We're low on supplies. We need to, rein it in a little bit. Now, whenever fresh, here's the disclaimer, the caveat. Whenever fresh provisions can be procured for the army, the rations are to be the same allowance. So procure, they live off the land. They're depending on these people here in the colonies to provide for their army. So in some cases, procured can be interpreted as taken. These British forces the Crown forces are constantly foraging as they're marching on campaign, and it was no different in the Philadelphia campaign and the leading weeks getting into the outset of the Philadelphia campaign's engagements. So to put things into context for you, the daily need for beef of General Howe's army at the time in 1777 would have been over 20,000 pounds of cattle. And the average weight of live cattle in the 18th century was anywhere between 900 to 1,000 pounds. So that's a lot of heads of livestock that they're going to need to start foraging for. And that's exactly what they do, especially after a 2.5 week extra long voyage from their originally anticipated travel route. So we do know that the records that these British commissaries were keeping, the quartermasters on these ships that are experiencing the devastating effects of this extra long voyage, indicate that they are desperate for supplies. And so as soon as they disembark off these ships, they're sending foraging parties out into the Maryland countryside, and they actually have to stop and collect some provisions for almost 2 weeks before they can do any marching north. And as they continue to march north into Pennsylvania, it is like a plague of locusts coming through the countryside. They are taking precious supplies from these people that are gearing up for the winter. They're stockpiling everything. It's going to be no different for this rich agricultural area of Chester County that encompasses the battlefield landscape. So this is the battlefield landscape right here. The battlefield landscape encompasses 35,000 acres, 15 different municipalities, and 2 modern counties, Delaware and Chester County. At the time, Delaware County was a part of Chester County. It wasn't until 1789 when when the borders were redrawn and Delaware County was founded. So this is all Chester County at the time of the Battle of Brandywine. Again, 15 different municipalities, 35,000 acres. It is a massive area to cover. And so just to give you a little bit of background of the battle, I know a lot of people on here are probably well versed in the events that took place, but for those who aren't, we have essentially George Washington coming into the area on September 9th, 1777. He's going to fortify the Delaware River, excuse me, the Brandywine River on the eastern heights, and he's going to cover major crossing points known as fords. What he fails to do is cover two of the most northern fords, which are Trimble's and Jeffrey's fords, on the forks of the Brandywine, where I'm kind of circling right now. All he had really was up until Buffington's ford cover, which is going to be, a major, that's going to be the Achilles heel, the blunder that Washington is going to do, because the British, who are camped out in Kennett Square the day before the battle, they are going to gain all the necessary intelligence that they need to tell them that Washington had made this fatal error. And General Howe's battle plan essentially called for two columns leaving Kennett Square, one under the command of a Hessian General Wilhelm von Kniphausen, to march straight down the Great Nottingham Road, which is modern-day Route 1 today, at Washington's defenses, which are concentrated at Chad's Ford, to create a feint and distract Washington, while the other column, leaving north out of Kennett Square, is marching with the bulk of the British forces, the Crown forces, to cross those two unguarded fords and to outflank Washington. The idea was, in General Howe's mind, that the war would end here along the banks of the Brandywine if he could fully envelop Washington's forces after he made that fatal error. So Washington is going to be attacked by Kniphausen in the early morning hours. Kniphausen is going to do his job to a T. He is going to essentially have his forces spread out wide to create the illusion that there are more men out there than there really are, and he's going to bombard the American forces all morning long. Now, this bombardment was so loud that 23 miles away in Philadelphia, the inhabitants of that city could hear it clear as day, and they thought that the battle was actually closer than it really was. So you can only imagine the panic that was ensuing in the colonial capital that day. Now, General Howe, he crosses the forks of the Brandywine, and he is not going to get into position until roughly 3:30 in the afternoon. And all morning long, Washington is gaining these contradicting intelligence reports. But in the latter part of the afternoon, around 2:30 in the afternoon, he is going to get the confirmation that he has indeed been outflanked, and a large body of the Crown forces are forming up behind his lines, and Washington has to adapt quickly. So in order to do that, he moves three of his major divisions from the position at Chad's Ford north to what is known as Birmingham Hill in Birmingham Township. That is directly in front of the Birmingham Friends Meeting House, which was being used by Washington as a field hospital. So not only was he scrambling to get men up into position on top of Birmingham Hill, but he was also scrambling to evacuate sick and wounded out of this makeshift field hospital that had commandeered the Birmingham Friends Meeting House, which we'll talk about here in a second. And so this is where the major combat takes place at the Battle of Brandywine. This is going to be where General Howe launches a full-on assault at General Washington's forces atop Birmingham Hill. And these are the cream of the crop for the Crown forces. You have the Royal Guards that were the elite soldiers of the British forces at that time. You have the British Grenadiers, another company of elite forces. You also have the British Light Infantry, a newly formed type of infantry in the middle of the 18th century that was trying to break the norm of these long linear formations on the battlefield. So all in all, General Howe has at his disposal some of the best soldiers in the world on top, trying to attack Washington's forces at Birmingham Hill. Now, luckily, the three divisions that Washington sends up there, two of those three divisions are going to get into a good defensive position, and those are under the command of Adam Stephen and William Alexander Sterling, so the American right and center. John Sullivan, at the last minute, is tacked on, and he is going to take an entirely different route that Sterling and Stephen takes, and he finds himself completely out of position. He is too far left, he is too far forward from the rest of the American line, and there is a huge gap, and that is going to ultimately, after a series of about an hour, after a series of fighting, waves of British soldiers going up and back and down Birmingham Hill over the course of an hour and a half, 6 times, that's going to be the ultimate cause of Washington's lines breaking on top of Birmingham Hill. So Washington is able to get men up there. He puts up one heck of a stance for about an hour and a half, but eventually he is overwhelmed, because at the same time, Kniphausen is finally crossing down at Chad's Ford. He's sending his men that had been distracting Washington from the western side of the Brandywine all morning long across to attack Anthony Wayne's Pennsylvanians, William Maxwell's Light Infantry Corps, as well as the American militia that are stationed. So Washington knows that he cannot overcome a two-front battle at this point, and it's starting to get later in the day. It's starting to become dusk. He knows he's got to get his men off the field, so he calls upon Nathaniel Greene, who was one of his top generals at that time, to make a bold march, 3.5 miles. Nathaniel Greene does this in record-breaking time. It varies to less than a half hour in time, but all in all, it is a very, very quick march, and he forms up a defensive position just to the west of modern day 202, in the vicinity of where the right behind the Painters Crossing movie theater is, and that is going to be the savior of Washington's retreat, because without that rearguard defense, Washington would have never been able to get off the field that day. The pursuing British forces are stopped dead in their tracks when they walk into this full envelopment of Greene's men, and General Howe calls an all stop to that pursuit. So again, that's going to be the saving grace. Now, this day does take a lot out of the British soldiers and the Hessian forces that are marching under Howe's command. From 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, the majority of these forces had been marching till about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was almost 95 degrees that day, all wool. It was a grueling march, and General Howe knew this. His men were fatigued. It was a long day, so he has to recover, and so he is going to camp out with his forces in this area for 5 days following the battle, and that's really when things start to go downhill for the civilian population living in Birmingham Township at this time. And we'll go back to these 3 Quakers that we were focusing on before, starting with Gideon Gilpin. Gideon Gilpin, who tried to remain as neutral as possible leading up to the Battle of Brandywine in 1778, because of his losses and damages at the hands of the British forces, he is going to finally take an oath of allegiance that was required by this newly formed government of Pennsylvania. His losses, as you can see at the bottom there, are going to be in the 502 pound range, which in today's currency is roughly $86,000. He is going to virtually lose everything to the British. And so with that, he is also going to take over a local place of business. Now, from 1776 to 1778, there was no local tavern in the Chad's Ford area here. And according to Gideon Gilpin's tavern petition, there was a desperate want and need for a public house of entertainment. So Gilpin is going to be the one who's willing to take over this tavern business to help compensate for his losses. So between taking the oath of allegiance and the sale of alcohol, the taking over of the tavern business, he is going to be formally complained of in 1779, and he is expelled or read out of his monthly meeting. Not exactly an ideal Quaker. Records indicate that up until the year of 1782, he is going to support the local militia, the Chester County militia, Birmingham in particular. And finally in 1789, he is going to give up the tavern business. So 12 years after the Battle of Brandywine, suffering those losses, he is eventually going to relinquish the tavern business. He is going to admit to his wrongdoings, and he will eventually be accepted back into his Quaker place of worship. So he is going to suffer tremendously so tremendously that he is going to abandon his neutral Quaker beliefs that guided him his entire life up until the Battle of Brandywine, to compensate for his losses. So that gives you a powerful image there. Likewise, you have Benjamin Ring. Benjamin Ring was in support of the Continental cause leading up to the Battle of Brandywine. His home was Washington's headquarters. All right, now I'm going to go back to a map here, and I want you to take a look at Kniphausen's column here. You can see all the retreating men down Route 1 or the Great Nottingham Road, but this is where Kniphausen's column ends up. And this is where they camp for 5 days. They are smack dab right in the middle of Brandywine Battlefield Park, right in between or on these two Quakers' properties, Benjamin Ring and Gideon Gilbert. So these are probably going to be not only the heaviest hit homes, but some of the first hit homes immediately following the engagement. Family records tell of Ring's experiences immediately following the battle. Benjamin Ring disappeared for this entire British occupation of 5 days. His house was at the mercy of the British. And so when he comes back, the Ring family itself evacuated, but him and his two oldest boys stuck around, and they abandoned the home for 5 days during the occupation. When they come back, they find nothing but chaos. Apparently there were feathers and ticking from the bedding all over the yard. The furniture was broken up and spread throughout the property. There were drawers that were used to mix flour to make bread. The firewood from the furniture were spread out throughout the property as well. So, and this comes from a series of letters between Samuel Ring and Eliza Cunningham, two cousins in 1859, basically recounting Grandma and Grandpa's experience. They were the grandchildren of Benjamin and Rachel Ring, going back and forth, swapping stories about Grandma and Grandpa's experience during and after the Battle of Brandywine. Now, for the longest time, we really didn't know to what extent Benjamin Ring suffered in terms of damages. It wasn't until recently that we were able to obtain his damage claims, and you can see that it wasn't until the year of 1795, well after the American Revolution and his sufferings at the Battle of Brandywine, that Ring is finally going to come forward and plead his case to the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. And the damages are going to show that he suffered catastrophic depredations. And his losses were in the ballpark of around 737 pounds, which in today's currency amount to about $121,000. And so going off of that, these are also associated with those damage claims. Basically, he suffered tremendously, and that he didn't even have a coat to put on, and his neighbor had to provide him with a coat because he didn't even have that. And at the bottom here, you can see that he is signing off on a contribution from the Friends in England of 100 pounds, which at that time in 1795 would have been roughly around $14,000, which would have never come close to his total sufferings. So Benjamin Ring is suffering well after the American Revolution, well after the Battle of Brandywine. And finally, in 1795, he is going to plead his case and get some sort of compensation for his losses. But again, that's not even going to put a dent. Benjamin Ring passes away in 1804. Doesn't even leave a will behind. And he dies poor and penniless. Wealthiest man in the neighborhood is going to go to one of the most impoverished one of the neighborhood. Joseph Townsend, similar experience. Joseph Townsend is going to, again, give us one of the greatest civilian accounts of the Battle of Brandywine, especially the aftermath of the Battle of Brandywine, because that's where the title from this program actually comes from. Townsend is going to witness the occupation of the British forces. He is going to assist the doctors that are caring for both American soldiers and British soldiers and Hessian soldiers in his place of worship, the Birmingham Meeting House. Now, the day of the Battle of Brandywine, they were actually holding meeting in a wheelwright shop right outside of what was known in the 18th century as Scuttletown. Not much remains of Scuttletown other than a road being named after it, a state placard. But Scuttletown was a well-known village, and that's going to be where the wheelwright shop was. That the Friends of Birmingham meeting were holding meeting the day of the battle, and they look outside and they see an entire column of William Howe and the cream of the crop of the British forces coming straight down. Joseph and his neighbors are taken in under a vanguard of British guards, and they are forced to stay close to the British column for the duration of the day's engagement, because the British didn't want to risk any spies getting word to Washington that they were out there. And so he's not only going to witness the day itself, but the aftermath of, again, the medical care, the treatment of soldiers, as well as the destruction and wanton waste, as he calls it in his memoirs, that took place following the battle. Now, this had such an impact on Joseph Townsend that in 1782 he just sells the family farm up and leaves Chester County and moves down to Baltimore for the remainder of his life. It had such a profound impact that he remained an ardent and pacifist Quaker for the remainder of his life. He was known in the community of Harford County, Maryland, to assist in hospitals and other charitable organizations. And so he during the War of 1812, he actually cared for wounded American soldiers in Baltimore. So this is going to have such a prolific impact on Joseph Townsend that, and it's evident in his accounts that he writes of his experiences at the Battle of Brandywine shortly before the time of his death in 1841. And this is an image of page 1 of that account. We do have facsimiles, and I'm hopeful that that will be part of our new exhibit in the museum at Brandywine. So again, we invite you to come down once that time has come. So all in all, you can see that this is going to be a devastating impact on these 3 Quaker men living in Birmingham Township following the Battle of Brandywine in the aftermath of the British occupation. And just to go off of that, to leap forward a little bit off of that, we have the British Army's occupation and the impact by the numbers here. So these are all depredations from Chester County within the 15 municipalities that encompass the Brandywine battlefield landscape. So you have in Kennet 36 heads of livestock. So you have 8 horses, 14 cows, 14 hogs. East Marlborough Township, 3 horses. Newland Township, 7 horses. Pennsbury, 13 horses, 49 sheep, 10 cows, 9 hogs, 24 fowls, 105 in total. Thornbury Township, 6 horses, 58 sheep, 16 cows, 80. Westtown, 5, 1, 29. West Bradford, 24, 5. Chadds Ford, 3, 48, 29, 28. All right, we're starting to get a little bit closer to where the concentration of the British forces were. Concord Township, see that? Birmingham Township, where these 3 gentlemen lived. 32 horses, 196 sheep, 108 cows, 141 hogs, 477 heads of livestock. That accounts for 49.5% of the livestock taken by the Crown forces within those municipalities. Suffered tremendously. To add to that, 4,627 pounds of cheese. It's enough for 18,000 British soldiers to receive a quarter pound each for one day. 81% of the total cattle population of Birmingham Township was taken. That was enough to feed 18,000 British soldiers for 10 days. 4,287 bushels and 550 tons of hay. That's for the horses and livestock alone. 10,000 fence rails, firewood, just taken in Birmingham Township alone. All these damages, nearly $400,000 in 2020. Devastating, as you can see. Here's the Joseph Townsend account that really drives everything home here. It reads as follows: "We had the full opportunity of beholding the destruction and the wanton waste committed on the property of the peaceful inhabitants of the neighborhood and on the ground of the encampment. Those who were obliged to remain had their stock of cattle destroyed for the use of the army, their houses taken away, and their household furniture, bedding, etc., wantonly wasted and burned. It was not uncommon to see heaps of feathers lying about the farms, the ticks having been stripped off and used up, and the remains of small pieces of valuable furniture which lay about their fireplaces in the fields unconsumed, when there was no want of timber and fence rails that might have been used for their cooking. Being in an enemy's country, inhabited by rebels, there was no restraint on the soldiery or rabble who accompanied them." So Joseph Townsend gives you a very, very good idea of what these guys were experiencing. So why does all of this matter? It fosters a better understanding of the civilian impact of war during the American Revolution and in modern times as well. Looking back at the politics of the time, it helps us realize that polarization has been an ongoing issue for centuries, and we, in some cases, still deal with it today. One side versus the other, you never take into consideration the people in the middle that are just trying to avoid everything, but somehow get swept under the fury of it all. And also, it helps us gain a better understanding of past situations to prevent present issues. All right. So, as I was referring to earlier, if you want to get a better idea of more depredations, damage claims, property owners, roads that existed at that time, since Chester County was such a well-connected and well-established community during the American Revolution, I encourage you to go over to what the Chester County Archives, their most recent project. It is crucial for interpretation surrounding the battle, and just to get a good understanding of what life was like in the 18th century. It goes into great detail about property owners, old boundaries, roads, different existing structures, such as mills, wheelwright shops, all of that good stuff. I encourage you to get over there. It's a great tool, and major props and kudos to the folks over at the Chester County Archives for producing this important tool. So next month's program. This is our first one of many to come. We're trying to do this on a monthly basis to provide public programming to all of you folks. Our next month's speaker is Dr. Ronald S. Gibbs. He is going to dive into medicine in the American Revolution. More information about that talk and a little bit more information about Dr. Gibbs will be posted in the next few days on our website, as well as registration information for that. That will be on April 22nd at 7 p.m. Dr. Gibbs was actually recently featured on the American Revolution podcast, giving a similar talk. Very knowledgeable, very well versed in both 18th century medicine and modern medicine as well. So we're looking forward to having him come in and present a little bit more information on a very interesting topic, to say the least. You might not want to eat before that one. So I will now field some questions here, if you have any for me. So I will stop sharing my screen for the time being, and I will field some questions if there are any. All right. If there are no questions, I will go ahead and thank you all for coming out this evening. I greatly appreciate it. I would like to thank the Chester County Planning Commission for allowing us to use their platform tonight. I would like to thank Nancy Shields for being instrumental in setting all of this up for the Park Associates. I'd also like to thank Janine Spears for assisting in setting all of this up as well. And I want to leave you with a very short video on what we've been doing recently at the park. Obviously, we have been closed, and that doesn't mean we haven't been working. We have obtained through various foundations, community-based organizations, the funding and the capability to convert our very popular educational programs that students would usually participate in if they were to come on field trips at the park into digital format. So students will now have the ability to take virtual field trips and learn remotely and safely from home or from the classroom without having to leave the school. So without further ado, I'm going to end the program on a little promotional video to highlight the project so far. There are 10 videos that have been produced, and all the information for the digital programming is now available on our website, foranybattlefield.org. So I encourage you to go over there, check it out. And if you are an educator or know an educator or teacher, please kindly pass this along, because it's a very useful tool that I feel could be very important for keeping the history alive and accessible to students. It's an important time period in American history. It's important that we get everybody educated on it. So without further ado, I will go ahead. Again, thank you all for coming out. And
Andrew, there is one question.
Oh, there is one question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yes, this presentation will be available later. So it will be available on our YouTube channel, and it will be also available, I would assume, through the Chester County Planning Commission's social media YouTube as well. We will have links on our social media as well as our website where you can access this. Probably in the next few days, we'll probably gain access to it, and we'll have a turnaround for it. So thank you very much. So are there any other questions before I play the video? Very good. Again, thank you all for coming out, and we'll see you next month, April 22nd, 7 p.m. for Dr. Ronald Gibbs.
On first, platoon. Left!
In this program, we'll talk about those that fought in the American Revolution, specifically in George Washington's Continental Army. In the 18th century, however, there was no concept of germs, bacteria, or foreign organisms in the mind of a doctorate. You have a third column. That's where the Quakers fell. So when I go to write, I'm going to take it and I'm going to loop it around, like so. A soldier's gear was carried in something called a haversack.
Today we're going to be talking about blacksmithing.
Let's see what we would find in here.
And it would shoot out the rest of the barrel. Together, they all settled just to the north of where we're standing today.
With excessive fatigue, from 4 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock at night, we marched.
Put yourself in the shoes of the people that are going through these scenarios and think of the hard decisions and hardships that they had to endure at this time.